The deep, resonant hum of the Boeing 747's four massive engines was usually Dr. Ethan Vance's signal to finally exhale. As a seasoned pediatric surgeon with over a decade immersed in the raw chaos of emergency rooms and the stark, controlled precision of operating theaters, the rhythmic drone of flight was a rare, cherished luxury. He was on his way home to Chicago, escaping the draining aftermath of a medical conference in Los Angeles that had left his brain feeling like scrambled static and every muscle in his body protesting. Reclined in his window seat, a well-worn medical journal lay forgotten on his lap, his gaze occasionally drifting out to the mesmerizing patchwork of illuminated cities far below, each a tiny galaxy of human lives, utterly unaware of the drama unfolding above them. The cabin was a cocoon of hushed whispers and soft snores, most passengers either asleep or quietly engrossed in the glow of their personal screens. It was the kind of tranquil late-night flight that promised an easy return to the comfort of routine. Then, without warning, a piercing, desperate shriek tore through the hushed cabin, shattering the serenity. It wasn't the startled cry of a baby or the whiny protest of an impatient toddler. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated terror, sharp and guttural, resonating with a primal fear. Ethan's professional instincts, usually dormant outside the sterilized walls of the hospital, flared to life with an almost painful intensity. His head snapped up, his heart immediately picking up a frantic rhythm against his ribs. The sound came from a few rows ahead, near the aisle, a terrifying beacon in the dim light. People were stirring, their faces a mixture of confusion and dawning concern, craning their necks, their eyes wide and searching. A flight attendant, a young woman named Emily, whose cheerful smile he'd noticed during boarding, was already moving, her stride quickening to a desperate rush toward the source of the commotion. A second sound followed, a horrifying, choked, ragged gasp, followed by the terrifying, unmistakable silence of someone fighting for air and losing. Then a woman's voice, frantic and utterly broken, screamed, "She's choking! My baby! She's choking!" The words hit Ethan like a physical blow. He was out of his seat before he even consciously decided to move, the comfortable lethargy of vacation, instantly stripped away. He snatched his small carry-on bag, his mind already racing through the possible scenarios, the critical protocols. He was a surgeon, yes, but this was an airplane thousands of feet in the air with no equipment, no team, no sterile environment. Just a desperate mother and a dying child. He pushed through the tightening knot of bewildered passengers, a wave of collective panic starting to ripple through the cabin, a low hum of fear replacing the engine drone. A child's small, limp body came into view, held by a distraught mother, whose name he would later learn was Jessica. She was desperately, ineffectually, trying to dislodge something from the child's throat, her face tear-streaked and contorted in pure horror. The child, a girl no older than 5, was alarmingly blue around the lips, her small eyes wide and unseeing, staring into nothingness. Her tiny chest was heaving with silent, terrifying force, but no air entered or left her lungs. Her small hands, no bigger than his thumb, clawed weakly at her throat, a silent, desperate plea for breath. This wasn't just a choking incident. This was a complete critical airway obstruction, and with every passing second, oxygen was being starved from her brain, threatening irreversible damage. Ethan knew with a chilling absolute certainty that they had mere minutes, maybe seconds, before it was too late. The air in the cabin suddenly felt thin, suffocating, as if he too was struggling for breath. The frantic energy around the choking child was a chaotic blur. The mother, Jessica, was a portrait of raw, primal terror, performing desperate, ineffectual backblows, each one a futile prayer against the inevitable. Her hands trembled violently, her every movement fueled by a maternal instinct, stripped bare. Another flight attendant, a more senior man named Robert, stood by the intercom, his voice surprisingly calm, despite the visible tension in his jaw. broadcasting a desperate plea for any medical personnel, his words echoing ominously through the cabin. Ethan, dropping to his knees beside the struggling child, felt an intense surge of adrenaline. The mother, through her sobs, managed to choke out the child's name. Lily. Ethan quickly assessed Lily. Her skin was a horrifying, dusky ashen, almost cyanotic around her small mouth, and her chest was rising and falling with terrifying silent force. No sound, no breath, just the desperate, empty struggle. Her eyes were fixed, starting to roll back, a terrifying sign of oxygen deprivation. He knew the standard maneuvers, textbook back blows, the Heimlich. He performed them quickly, expertly, leveraging his own weight, precise and powerful, praying for a miracle to dislodge the unseen killer. Nothing. Lily remained unresponsive, her small body going completely limp in her mother's trembling arms. A dead weight. A wave of cold dread washed over him. Time was running out. He needed to see what was obstructing her airway. Fumbling in his medical bag, he pulled out a small penlight. He peered into her throat, the beam cutting through the dim cabin light. Deep inside, just beyond the reach of his fingers, he saw it, a small, irregular piece of hard candy, wedged firmly, completely blocking her trachea. It was too far down to dislodge with standard methods, and attempting to reach it blindly would only push it further, or worse, cause irreparable damage to her fragile airway. The oxygen deprivation was growing critical by the second. He could see the faint mottled blue marbling on her skin, the alarming signs of severe hypoxia. A silent countdown ticking in his head, a cold dread, sharp and absolute, washed over Ethan. He was a surgeon. He opened people up. He operated with scalpels of gleaming steel, with perfect shadowless light, with the controlled peace of anesthesia, with a specialized team of trained professionals and a vast array of instruments at his fingertips. Here, he had none of that. He had the frantic heartbeat of a desperate mother, the terrified whispers of 200 passengers, the suffocatingly confined space of an airplane cabin, and a dying child in his arms. He knew with terrifying clarity what had to be done: a cricothyrotomy, an emergency airway incision. But the thought of performing such a delicate, life-or-death procedure in these conditions, without proper tools, without even sterile gloves, was horrifying, almost unthinkable. Yet the alternative was certain: agonizing death for Lily. His eyes scanned his small medical bag, a desperate hope blooming, then dying, as he saw only basic first aid supplies, bandages, antiseptic wipes, nothing that could help. Then his gaze, frantic and desperate, landed on a simple pen in the flight attendant's pocket. A common click-top ballpoint pen. An impossible, desperate, almost insane idea sparked in his mind. The cap, the hollow tube of the cap. He had to improvise. The immense pressure of the situation was a suffocating weight, a desperate fight against the unforgiving clock, against the very limitations of their environment, against the very definition of impossible. "I need a pen." Dr. Vance's voice, usually calm and measured in an operating room, was now sharp, urgent, cutting through the rising murmurs of panic in the cabin. A click pen, and something sharp. Anything. Emily, the young flight attendant, her face still stark white with fear, immediately understood the desperate urgency in his eyes. She dashed to the galley, returning moments later with a cheap plastic ballpoint pen and a tiny, almost ceremonial plastic knife from the meal service. Ethan's hands, usually a surgeon's steady, precise instruments, trembled slightly as he took them, the flimsy plastic feeling inadequate, horrifyingly so. He examined the pen, its simple mechanics now a potential tool for salvation. With a decisive snap, he broke off the pen cap, examining its hollow tube. It was crude, flimsy, far from ideal, but it was hollow. It was all he had. He explained quickly, concisely, his words clipped and precise, to Jessica and the flight attendants gathered around, his voice low but firm, overriding their fear with a desperate, professional calm. "She needs an emergency airway. I'm going to make an incision here." He pointed to the small depression in Lily's throat, And insert this. It's the only way to get her breathing. Jessica, tears streaming down her face, nodded numbly, her eyes wide and fixed on her daughter, her trust absolute, terrifyingly so. Robert, the senior flight attendant, moved with surprising efficiency, quickly creating a makeshift sterile field with clean napkins and a splash of water, a small island of order in the chaos. Passengers were now pressed against the windows and the seatbacks, a silent, terrified audience, their faces reflecting the horror and desperate hope that hung in the air like a thick fog. Ethan positioned Lily carefully on a flattened seat, tilting her head back to expose her small, vulnerable neck. He felt for the precise spot, the cricothyroid membrane, a small soft depression just above the Adam's apple, the tiny gateway to life. His fingers, accustomed to feeling the nuances of human tissue, now felt for it with agonizing, prayerful precision. He took the plastic knife, its edge barely sharp enough to scratch skin, and, taking a deep, fortifying breath, made a small, careful incision. The first attempt was a shallow cut. Not enough. He pressed harder, his hands sweating, the flimsy knife slipping slightly on the taut skin. He could feel the collective gaze of everyone in the cabin on him, their hopes, their fears, resting on his shaking, improvised instruments. The silence was deafening, broken only by the hum of the plane and the frantic beating of his own heart. Finally, with a soft tear of tissue, he felt the resistance give way. A tiny, almost imperceptible opening appeared, a desperate portal. Time was running out. Lily was limp, her small body terrifyingly still, her breathing completely absent now. He took the pen cap, aligning it with the small incision. It was awkward, far from ideal, the plastic barely rigid enough. He pushed, gently but firmly, feeling the flimsy plastic tube slide into place. The moment it entered, a rush of air, ragged and precious, whistled through the improvised tube. Lily's chest, which had been terrifyingly still, suddenly gave a small, convulsive heave. Her lips, still blue, seemed to gain a faint, almost imperceptible hint of pink. Mark felt a flood of relief so profound it nearly buckled his knees. He held the pen cap firmly in place, his breath ragged, the miracle of air entering her lungs through a tiny plastic tube, a testament to desperation and ingenuity. With the pen cap in place, a tenuous but vital airway established, Lily's breathing remained shallow but consistent, a faint, rasping sound that to Ethan was more beautiful than any symphony. He held the improvised tube steady, his hand cramping from the awkward, prolonged position, his eyes fixed on Lily's small chest, watching for every agonizing rise and fall, every fragile intake of air. Jessica, her face still streaked with tears, now held Lily's small hand, murmuring soft words of encouragement, her hope palpable, a fragile new beginning. Robert, the senior flight attendant, was back on the intercom, his voice strained but triumphant, cutting through the remaining fear in the cabin. "Attention, everyone! We have an airway established. The child is breathing." A wave of hushed, grateful murmurs rippled through the cabin, swelling into a wave of silent, tearful relief, as if a collective weight had been lifted, the co-pilot who had been coordinating. With air traffic control now came over the intercom, his voice crackling with urgent authority. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your co-pilot. We are diverting immediately to JFK International Airport due to the medical emergency. We're beginning our emergency descent now. Please remain calm and prepared for a rapid approach." The plane began its rapid, steep descent, the sensation of falling amplified by the lingering tension in the cabin. The engines whined louder, a high-pitched protest, and the air pressure shifted noticeably, popping ears, a visceral reminder of their plummeting altitude. Ethan continued to monitor Lily, explaining to Jessica what was happening, his voice low and steady, reassuring her with quiet, professional words despite the storm raging outside and within him. He felt the plane shudder, the flaps deploying with a distinct mechanical thud, followed by the soft whir of the landing gear extending. Every jostle, every shift, every lurch was a terrifying reminder of their precarious situation, hurtling towards a tiny strip of asphalt far below. He had done his part, given Lily a chance, a fragile thread of life. But they were still thousands of feet in the air, dependent on the skill of pilots, dependent on gravity itself. Finally, after what felt like an eternity suspended between life and death, the familiar thump, thump, thump of tires on a runway filled the cabin, a sound more glorious than any applause. A collective gasp, then an explosion of spontaneous cathartic applause, tears, and shouts of relief erupted from the passengers. The plane braked hard, a gentle shudder bringing it to a complete, glorious stop. Ethan slumped against the seat, his body trembling uncontrollably, the immense flood of adrenaline finally draining from him, leaving him profoundly exhausted. He looked down at Lily, her small chest still rising and falling, a faint flush returning to her cheeks. She was alive, a miracle, powered by desperation and a pen cap. As the emergency medical team swarmed the plane, a blur of flashing lights and hurried movements rushing to Lily's side, Ethan finally stepped back, letting the professionals take over. He watched as they carefully stabilized the crude pen cap and prepared her for immediate transport to a hospital. Jessica, her eyes red and swollen but full of profound, overwhelming gratitude, reached out and gripped his hand, her touch surprisingly strong. "Thank you," she choked out, her voice thick with emotion, tears now of pure relief. "You saved her. You saved my baby." Ethan just nodded, unable to speak, overwhelmed by the enormity of it all. He was a surgeon who had just performed an impossible surgery with a pen cap at 35,000 feet in the chaotic heart of a terrified airplane. The terrifying roar of the engines, the screams of the passengers, had been replaced by the roar of life, a sound he would never, ever forget. His hands, still faintly smelling of antiseptic and airplane cabin, had delivered a miracle.